Helps if I start at the beginning, though. So the aim of tonight is to show you why mobility is important and how archaeology can engage with it better. I obviously can't talk about everything in the book, but I can at least provide a flavour of it. First thing, though, I want to start with this little chap. This is a sea squirt. These fascinating creatures live on the ocean floor, merrily moving around and feeding. That is, until they find the ideal rock located in water that is the perfect temperature and with plenty of food around. And then, having found their home beneath the sea, they fix themselves to it and eat their own brains. They do this because once they take up residence, they never move again. Literally, the only reason the sea squirt has a brain is to enable movement. Movement is the most extraordinary thing ever developed by living creatures. Judging by the little sea squirt, there is no other reason for having a brain or probably muscles. More than building a house or a monument or napping stone or making fire, moving is the most important thing we've ever done in the history of humankind. In truth, there would be no kind of humanity without it. Mobility makes us everything that we are and ever have been. To move is to be alive. And mobility is deeply embedded within our thoughts. A line of thought is a path along which our thoughts travel. They proceed step by step, arriving at the next point, hoping to reach a conclusion. At times, our mind races along. At other times, it gets stuck. Occasionally, our mind wanders and goes off on flights of fancy. With a good argument, you can wrong foot someone and put them on the back foot, but best foot forward. And if you have one foot in the grave, you are likely to be on your last legs. Love is often expressed as a journey along a path too. Relationships can go far, couples gravitating towards one another with no turning back. Or they can reach a crossroads and eventually choose to go their separate ways because they've run out of steam. Some relationships go nowhere, of course, or find that the path is long and bumpy, while other relationships simply fly from the start. In many societies, time is conceptualized as moving, with the future normally understood as in front of us while the past is behind. We face forward towards the future. We look forward to some things, Christmas perhaps. Time is coming or long since gone. It also flies if you're having fun, but we don't want it to pass us by. Movement pervades our entire conceptual system, leaving a long trail of metaphorical language, and is used to grasp abstract concepts such as love and time. We experience the world through bodily motions, and we learn about the world through and the things in it through movement. Walking as thinking has a long history, traced back at least the peripatetics of ancient Greece. The Greek sage walking along a colonnade followed by his pupils may be perhaps a bit of a caricature, but it is suggested that Plato taught while walking, and Aristotle was known as the walker due to teaching on the hoof. And numerous philosophers have invoked this Socratic tradition. Jean-Jacques Rousseau declared he could only think while walking. In his book, Reveries of a Solitary Walker, he describes his walks as flights of thought. Immanuel Kant undertook walks around Königsberg with such regularity that he was known as the Königsberg Clock. His route through the park was later named the Philosopher's Walk. Friedrich Nietzsche actually believed that walking produced better ideas. Only ideas won by walking have any value, he asserted in Twilight of the Idols. A similar walking philosophy can be traced through many of the Romantic period writers too. Henry David Thoreau, to take one example, was a heroic walker, and the author of the first philosophic treatise on it, simply called Walking. Famously, the writer Dorothy Wordsworth and her poet brother William walked compulsively, William composing his poems while his lyrical feet stepped out the meter. Virginia Woolf spent hours walking London, plotting her novels, street haunting, she called it, all around this area, I should say, and women engaging in a freer form of walking was a common theme in her books. And having a good understanding of past mobilities lies at the very heart of archaeology too. It allows us to discuss the movement of people, ideas, objects, and information from place to place, from one person to another. We can see movement by the artifacts we find, working out where they came from and comparing that to where they ended up. And mobility obviously figures highly in discussions of isotope and ancient DNA analysis. The Amesbury Archer here is a premier example of this. In this Bronze Age burial, we can see that not only did many of his grave goods come from distant lands, travelling far and wide, but so did he. A study of the isotopes within the enamel of his teeth tells us that he grew up in continental Europe, in the regions around the Western Alps. We can also see mobility in the skeletal record. Regular movements change and shape our bodies. Far from being a fixed structure, the skeleton is plastic and moldable, imperfect and breakable, vulnerable to disease and decay, and mobility scores itself into the body. Different habitual actions over a person's lifetime put strain on the skeleton. As a result, new bone tissue is preferentially added to the shafts of the bone under strain, changing their shape so that they can withstand the loads. People who regularly walk or run have thicker lower limb bones, while those who use their arms a lot have more robust upper limbs. We can see this in modern sports people. Studies have shown that swimmers and cricketers have pronounced bone growth in their arms, while cross-country runners and hockey players have the same in their legs. If someone uses one side of their body more than the other, this will lead to asymmetric bone growth. Tennis players have considerably thicker bones on their playing side than their non-playing side. And it works both ways too, so that a decreased activity leads to bone loss and more gracile bones. For the archaeologist, then, the body can provide insights into past repetitive movements. Another way of seeing movement in the archaeological record is through footprints. A great example of this are the footprints Martin Bell and colleagues have been excavating at Goldcliff in the Severn Estuary. These date to the Mesolithic period, around 7,000 years ago. Over 20 distinct trails have been recorded there now, some of them leading to known and excavated Mesolithic hunter-gatherer camps, others converging on points that presumably once had been campsites, and others still apparently leading to fish traps. Many of the printmakers are children, some as young as 4, showing that even the young were venturing out into the muddy estuary and contributing to community life. And my favourite of these, in fact, the scenario that I open the book Footmarks with, are a set of trails by 2 youngsters. One is probably 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 years old, and the other a little younger, 3 or 4. And as you might expect, the older child walks in this sensible, straightish line, and the youngster dances all around the older one. And then at some point, the youngster's footprints just disappear. And at that same point, the older child's footprints are just a little bit deeper into the mud, and clearly, perhaps out of frustration, they've bent down and picked up this child. These wonderful snapshots from the archaeological record. And from these tracks, we can record the length of their stride, as well as the pace at which each person was walking. The faster they ran, the further apart we find the footprints. A slow and steady speed leaves regular footprints close together. And from the size of their feet, we can say a certain amount about their age and their body size. Much more difficult to say something about their sex because the overlap between male and females is quite considerable. And we can see this in older examples too. The best known come from Laetoli on the southern margin of the Serengeti Plains in Africa. Here, the famous archaeologist Mary Leakey discovered the preserved footprints, dated to 3.66 million years ago, of an early human species, likely to be Australopithecus afarense, walking tall on two extended legs without crouching or using knuckles as support. The tracks belong to three individuals of different body sizes, tall, medium and small, and it's tempting to see them as a family unit. The smaller one walked, limping incidentally, alongside the larger, whilst the middle one walked behind and very carefully placed their footprints within the footprints of the larger one. So clearly, mobility has served archaeology well. And yet, on the whole, the actual act of movement and the role it plays in the production of social life from an archaeological point of view remains largely unexamined. It is rarely studied directly as a subject in and of itself, but more frequently as an aside. We can see this when we excavate a site. I am always struck by how all the action and the noise above ground on any archaeological site, the movement of hand and machine-dug earth and the endless flows of people, contrast with the static and silent understanding we impose on the lives we excavate below ground. I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. And before I move on, I just want to point out with my cursor there, that's my daughter. You see, archaeology, it remains in the family. Some years ago, I excavated a magnificent Neolithic site inside Marden Henge in the Vale of Pewsey in Wiltshire. We uncovered the well-preserved chalk floor of a 4,500-year-old building. A large hearth dominated the centre, and you can see that fired red in the middle of the image there. Around the fire, scattered over the floor, were pieces of pottery and flint flakes, lying exactly where they were originally dropped. Outside the building was a pile of pig bones, representing joints of meat roasted on the bone, and mixed in with this were pieces of grooved ware pottery. This pile of rubbish was not a dump that had accumulated over time. It wasn't a kitchen midden, if you like, but the result of a single action. It was the remnants of a feast. This scene was an astounding discovery, once in a lifetime, but what really struck me was how much it looked like the morning after the night before. The music stopped, debris strewn around, and all partygoers gone. In the Neolithic, this feast would have been accompanied by music and dancing, whirling perhaps, storytelling, chanting and chatter. I'm making that up, but it's not that improbable to think that. But we routinely don't think about such things. It would have been heady and sensuous, with a smell of wood smoke and roast pork and beer, combined with flickering flames, garish costumes, and, well, who knows, but perhaps the consumption of hallucinogenic mushrooms. But archaeologists always miss the party. And this stillness that we uncover feeds into how society generally learns about the past. Newspaper headlines, when a well-preserved archaeological site is discovered, describe it as frozen in time. Britain's Pompeii is another favourite. The implication is that something cataclysmic happened, rendering the site motionless. People stilled like statues with their arms raised up in horror. Archaeology is too often presented as a still photograph, and the significance of movement is overlooked. And incidentally, here we have a photograph of my wife. So there we go, keeping it in the family. The enormous Neolithic mound of Silbury Hill in Wiltshire is another wonderful monument I worked on. For over a year in 2007 and 2008, I led a team of archaeologists to excavate a tunnel into the centre of it to allow engineers and miners to stabilise a collapse that could be seen on the summit. We also hoped, obviously, to understand something of how it was made and glimpse at the possible reasons why. One of the most striking things we discovered during our time in this tunnel was how, from the moment the mound was created until at least the medieval period, and probably much later, it was in constant motion, being added to and dug into, changed and altered. Quite a contrast with the way it was being managed and still is now, covered in short-cropped grass like a suburban garden or a golf course, all traces of humanity removed, as if preserved in aspic or covered in a bell jar, a precious artifact in need of protection from a dangerous world. And quite right too, you might say, but it does have the effect of imposing a stillness that wasn't there before. It reminds me of the way that oral stories are passed down generationally from parent to child, living things that alter as times change, but which, once they're written down, they become static and not to be messed with. And that can be deadening. For too long, there has been a tendency to focus on the fixed and more tangible elements of the past, on places rather than movement to, from, and around them. On the one hand, this is understandable because with place there is something to see and excavate. We can be in a settlement and go to a monument. Archaeologists like neatly bounded sites that we can draw around. If the site is of national importance, then we can also secure with legal protection as scheduled monuments. We like to impose boundaries, turning sites into containers of and for archaeology. And this is perhaps because mobility is an intangible subject to study, and archaeology deals poorly with the fleeting, the movement and displacement of people, things, and ideas. Mobility lacks a presence. But by studying only the site, we unthinkingly impose stillness on the past, and that, to me at least, is a form of disenchantment that can rob it of all wonder. Even when the movement of people or objects is identified, it is the place they come from or ended up that is highlighted, rarely discussed, are the movements in between. Place is always the starting point, not mobility. We prefer fixity over flow. But it is the movements in between that are the important elements of life. Life unfolds, says the anthropologist Tim Ingold, echoing, incidentally, the writer and journeyman Bruce Chatwin, not in places, but along paths. See, we miss the action, the real life, if we don't look at people's movements. Of course, places are important too, but we can afford to recognise that they are themselves made up by the restless patterns of people moving between and through them, from one chamber to another, in and out of shops and houses, through tangles of alleys, plazas, streets and roads. Places are designed for access and movement, and as we see in our own times, they pulsate with life. Movement defies the notion of a neatly bounded site or a monument. Of all sites, routeways are especially hard for heritage managers to protect, since they are long and linear and they run across land owned by multiple people. They are also seen as the opposite of monuments because they are often created by being worn down as opposed to built up, a negative feature rather than a positive, yet they are every bit as monumental. More so, in fact, they don't represent the actions of a few builders over a defined period, but the feat of many over vast lengths of time. Out of the 20,000 scheduled monuments in England, the only protected holloways, deeply incised paths, are also known as sunken ways, example on the screen, that I can find are short sections that have been included almost incidentally as components of other monuments. Few are scheduled on their own due to their own intrinsic importance. They are not automatically afforded the protection the more obvious archaeological sites receive. And who knows how many holloways there actually are? No one has ever attempted an audit of them in the way that they have other monuments like henges or hill forts. But that surely must be the starting point for protection. A recent project led by Natural England aims to change this, but perhaps it's telling that a similar project hasn't come from historic England, and therefore the emphasis being somewhat more their environmental importance than their historic value. In the village I live in, on the North York Moors, the earthwork remains of a medieval Motte and Bailey castle is a scheduled monument, but the tangled and radiating holloways, earthworks every bit as impressive as the Motte and Bailey, and of the same date, or perhaps even earlier, are not. So the landowners are free to scour them away, which they have done. Or, in the case of one I recently walked along, dug into and lined the bottom with hardcore. At least it's preserved now, you might say, but like writing down an oral story, or perhaps pinning a butterfly, it's no longer alive. And that seems a very great shame to me. And that's just one small example. Extend that out across the British Isles and across Europe and beyond, and you start to see the extent of the problem. Even where the ancient path is not worn down, it still represents a heritage asset. And that's because if a path is used over long periods, it becomes a very distinct ecosystem, quite different to the surrounding landscape. Seeds from animal droppings lead to particular plant communities growing up along trails. Humans add to this too, spitting out crabapple pips or blackberry seeds as we go, tossing plum or sloe stones to the side as we walk, or clumsily dipping into a pocket full of gathered hazelnuts and dropping one or two. Defecation along routes, both human and animal, adds nutrients and further enhances favourite food plants. In this way, we create very particular environments along paths, environments that need protecting for their unique natural and cultural value. When these paths are widened or removed altogether by landowners or councils, which incidentally happens much more than we care to admit, hundreds, even thousands of years of history are erased. The next time you walk along a path, picking at blackberry bushes and crabapple trees, think of the countless travellers who have been able, just like you, to stave off hunger because of that path. Give a thought too to the generations of people over centuries past that have created these distinct linear environments that you use. We are almost entirely blind to these plants now, but their existence along paths is no coincidence. When mobility is discussed in archaeology, it is often framed in highly rational terms, such as discussions surrounding optimal foraging strategies or nomadism and sedentism. It is framed as cost and benefit. Mobility strategies are chosen logically for their functional practicalities. It becomes an involuntary and behavioural reaction rather than a core component of the social world. This is what the anthropologist, just previously mentioned, Tim Ingold, has termed in his characteristically eloquent way as a head-over-heels approach. That is, a belief that rational intelligence happens in the head, whilst the feet are simply a mechanical response to the brain. Too often we describe the movements of people in the past as if they were all essentially robots, marching rationally and impassively across the landscape. Having worked out a route people took, we make maps that resemble the opening credits of the television series Dad's Army, with long arrows pointing to where people came from and where they went to. For good reasons, we look for rational explanations so that our discussions frame movement as logic. But the body is not a machine, and we don't walk in a uniform, regular way across a flat and even surface. Movement is complex, unpredictable, and often socially driven. In our own lives, we walk, shuffle, run, climb, dawdle, and dance. We pace, march, swing, dash, stroll, crawl, scramble, ramble, plod, hobble, trudge, and tramp. Linger, loiter, saunter, wander, and roam. And each of these kinds of movement give off different messages to the bystander. Other messages we might pass on through our walk include things like physical condition, age, or even just mood and emotional state. The vibrant energy of youth can be contrasted with the shuffling arthritic legs of old age, while a hobble may acknowledge a lifetime of hard work. A stooping trudge may be fatigue or depression or both. We walk differently depending on whether we are at the start of our journey or at the end of it, and by that I mean an actual journey or life's metaphorical trip. There are sporty runners and slow plodders. There are the pregnant, the overweight, the ill, and the injured. Mobility has different meanings depending on who you are, where you are, and what sex you are. Coming across a stranger in an otherwise empty woodland engenders a very different feeling than passing someone on a busy street. Someone walking uncomfortably close behind you on a street can feel threatening, depending on whether you and they are a man or a woman, young or old. The social, political, and cultural aspects of movement are frequently overlooked in archaeology. But as we see, mobility is full of significance and meaning, and we pass on a constellation of messages through it. It can be freedom and opportunity, just as it can be a form of control, or conversely, a way of resisting authority. A protest march, for example, And of course, significantly reduced mobility can be a form of resistance too, used to great effect in recent years by the Occupy movement. Mobility can be used to exert power over people and groups, refugees perhaps, and of course we're seeing that in Israel and Gaza right now. That is, that some people have control over mobility and others don't. Moving in a crowd can be pleasurable and tactile, with all bodies moving together, such as the heaving rhythmical masses seen at music festivals, while solitary movement can be a form of freedom and creativity, as the philosophers and writers we saw earlier showed. Some people and groups conform to socially acceptable levels of mobility and others do not. Unusually high mobility is often seen as deviance, something threatening, to be feared, to be suspicious of, something to be controlled. This can be seen in, for example, the persecution of Gypsy, Romani and traveller groups across Europe in recent history. Different mobilities often reflect inequalities of power within society, being more available to, say, one gender more than the other. Some people are also dependent on others in order to move. Children might have to travel with their parents, or a mobility impaired person may be dependent upon others to help them get around. Some have more mobility and others less. Further, people are affected by mobility either intentionally or unintentionally in different ways. For example, one group's mobility can reduce the mobility of another, while some movements are dependent on others. Some movements are unrestricted, others are bounded. Some are hard, requiring exertion, and others are easy. It is, in other words, unfair and unevenly distributed. Movement is also fundamentally an embodied experience. It works at the scale of the body and involves the entire body, including sight, hearing, touch, and smell. It uses the hands and the lungs. It could, for the more physical journeys, also include pain. Mobility is often entangled with feelings, desires, and emotions, and indeed certain journeys can be undertaken simply to generate a particular feeling or emotion. A pilgrimage is a good example of this. Moving is a physical, sensuous experience. The body senses as it moves and mediates in and through the world. The head is definitely not privileged over the heels. Moving, and in particular walking, is also inherently a social act, just as culture can be expressed through, say, clothes or art, so too can it be through the way a group moves. As the French sociologist Marcel Mauss pointed out in a famous essay, all bodily techniques, including walking, vary according to cultural and local conventions. People also frequently learn and practice additional ones according to age, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, circumstance, and choice. People move culturally and according to their environment, and it is framed differently by diverse groups in separate parts of the world and at a variety of times in the past. Individuals, too, can express themselves through the way they walk. As the famous philosophers, and I do apologise for throwing all of these philosophers at you, but the famous philosophizing brothers, the Gibb brothers, collectively known as the Bee Gees, put it, "You can tell by the way I use my walk. I'm a woman's man, no time to talk." In archaeology, we tend to forget about people strutting like John Travolta, and if I could just pause for a moment and talk about it, because this is a fantastic film, and I'm assuming that everyone in here has seen it, but that opening sequence of Saturday Night Fever is just John Travolta's feet. If you remember it, just his feet. The camera's not on his face or his clothes. None of those things matter. The only thing that matters are his feet, his dancing feet. And he's got this strut about him, this jive that really comes through in just the way he walks. Later on, when I was researching for this book, later on, I sort of dug into John Travolta, a bit like an excavation. Later on, he talks about that walk, because it's super famous, right? And he says it was the walk of coolness. It's a walk that he had learned really carefully from his black friends and from his school days in Brooklyn. And it is the walk of coolness. He's got this, this sort of performance about him. And we all do that. I have a certain walk as an academic. I walk around campus in a particular way. I walk at home in a slightly different walk. I don't know why, slightly stooping probably. But if I was born in Jamaica, I'd have a different walk. And if I was born in Japan, a different one again. We walk according to our cultural settings. Now all go home and watch this film. It's fantastic. But it really was not so different in the past. For Romans, walking was an ambulatory performance, and by their movement through the urban setting, they could advertise their status through motion. The Roman philosopher Seneca remarked, "We do not walk, we parade." The way one walked was of importance to Romans and separated men from women and free men from slaves. Elite males were expected to exhibit self-control and decorum in their bodies. Indeed, their gait justified their social status as much as conveying it. Young freeborn men were trained to walk the right way, to acquire the skill. A bit like finishing schools in more recent times, I suppose. The speed at which one walked at was also important. Slaves ran, but aristocratic men didn't, because they wanted to reflect a sort of a considered and cautious persona. They didn't linger either, because they didn't want to appear feminine. Seneca writes, "The sage does not need to walk timidly or one step at a time, for his confidence in himself is so great." As for Roman women, gait should be graceful, but not ostentatious. Ovid sets out the extremes to avoid in his poem, The Art of Love. The dainty woman, and this is quoting, that's not coming from me, the dainty woman swings her sides artfully, taking in air with her flowing tunic, and she haughtily takes measured steps. I don't know what that looks like. I'm assuming it's like this. Whereas the uncultured woman plods like the sunburned wife of an Umbrian farmer and takes huge straddling steps. Again, I don't know, something like that. So the ideal for Ovid lay somewhere between the two. And certain architectural features in the Roman villa provided settings for intellectual conversations, encouraging the movement of both the body and the mind. Gardens were private spaces that choreographed movements through colonnaded walkways and garden paths, so that the householder could have ambling conversations with guests. The rhythm of walking shaping the rhythm of talking, and vice versa. The same set of choreographed movements can also be seen in medieval and Renaissance formal gardens. Here, designed landscapes represented carefully contrived settings in which people moved along a set of staged processional routes where views were manipulated and people admired the intended compositions and symmetry in front of them. The views of the castle or residence were carefully unveiled to the visitor, stage by stage, to create a spectacle. The form and layout of these gardens were deliberately designed to order and guide movement. Set apart from the humdrum activities of everyday life, gardens provided a different space to move around in. Complex walkways provided for promenading conversations and amusing banter, for flirtation and whispered confidences amongst the shrubbery and away from prying eyes and ears of the household. Tunnel arbours and pergolas provided shade as well as seclusion for visitors to sit in quiet contemplation or for coquettish dalliances. Indeed, pleasure gardens were often associated in medieval art and literature with courtly love. Gardens were invested with complex meaning and symbolism, and appreciation of them required knowledge of the proper way of moving around them. This form of movement is the embodiment of structured, ritualized movement. This is not so different to 18th century pleasure gardens, which were designed to choreograph movement as well. Here are the Vauxhall Gardens in London. They were used to advertise status through motion and were loaded with meaning and power. In other words, just like Roman movement, walking was coded. It was a performance with an assumption that there was an audience to appreciate it. We see this in other countries too. In 19th century Paris, for example, bourgeois Parisians promenading along the boulevards and squares of Baron Haussmann's spectacular new city. These renovations were principally intended to allow a greater flow of traffic as well as social control, but they redefined urban space. And integral to Haussmann's work were new parks linked by boulevards from the city, and these were hugely popular. Both Parisians and tourists alike flocked to these new spaces to strike poses and show off their clothes and their sophisticated gait. Young dandies displayed their fine stockinged calves, and in fact some men even put sort of cushions down the back of their stockings to make their calves stand out so the women would look at them and go, "Whoa, look at those. Look at the calves on that man." That's how I imagine it. Impressionist painters such as Manet and Degas and Renoir went on to document this social spectacle. And as new lighting technologies emerged, promenading at nighttime became popular too. The notion of promenading was central to the rise of the society of spectacle, and verbs such as to stroll and to saunter, which had previously been associated with vagabonds, could now take on an air of respectability. Here's a leap for you. Much like formal gardens, some prehistoric monuments structured movement as well. Causewayed enclosures, henges, and timber and stone circles contain within them some form of structured movement. Here we have the Neolithic stone and timber circle of Woodhenge in Wiltshire. By analysing the formal deposition of artefacts within the monument, archaeologist Josh Pollard suggested that a sense of the movement through and around it can be determined. Clearly, there were rules to moving around this monument. The stone and timber settings regulated and controlled the movement. In a sense, this and similar monuments were coded spaces, much like the royal palaces or gardens we've just seen. And of course, structured movement like this also means that some people were restricted and perhaps excluded. In other words, it created a hierarchy. Clearly, movement around at least some prehistoric monuments was structured and choreographed. The architecture ordered movement and directed people, but it also controlled and restricted access and movement. Many of these themes, performative, meaningful, and gendered mobility, are exemplified by the act of going on a pilgrimage. And indeed, many of our prehistoric monuments may have originally been created as pilgrimage centres. The figure of a pilgrim is certainly an archetypal image of someone on the move, and pilgrimage was a significant reason for journeying in the past. A pilgrimage is characterized by movement, sometimes formalized, to and from sacred places that serve a wider community. It's not an everyday movement like hunting, gathering, or commuting, but a special occasion, generally planned well in advance. And it tends to be a movement between states of being, both physical and spiritual. In that sense, every part of the trip has heightened significance. For this reason, the appeal of a pilgrimage is in the journey as much as the start and end points. Dance is another good example of meaningful mobility. It is a means of expression, improvisation, and creativity, and yet it is frequently socially encoded and can be highly political. Both social and power relations can be played out through dance, and it is often codified with place, revealing an individual's belonging. In this way, bodily movement can enact place and place in society, reproducing, emphasizing, and refracting ideals of gender, issues of race and cultural differences, and so on. Bodily movement is loaded with meaning, and indeed dance, a bit like storytelling, may well have been a major driver in cultural mobility, particularly in prehistory, a point rarely considered. If a route is used by the same groups often enough for specific purposes, it can take on associations with them. Pilgrimage routes, as well as paths and roads to churches and religious shrines and other places of importance, sometimes took on the association with their destination and became themselves sacred, ceremonial, or ritual. Corpse roads are a good example of this. These were used in the medieval and later periods to transport the dead, along with any funeral party, to the nearest licensed burial ground, which in remote areas could be some miles over the countryside. One last journey before the individual's final resting place. And as a result of this association with the dead, these roads tend to accumulate special significance in folk tales, with stories of ghosts and processions of spirits moving along them. Crossroads seem to have always been interesting places too. Markers, stone crosses, and statues of saints were often placed at crossroads in the medieval period as landmarks for travellers. The place where traffic converges is clearly a good spot to advertise certain messages and reach wide audiences. Execution sites were also often located at crossroads. We can see this with the famous Tyburn gallows in London, which existed from at least the 12th century through to the early 18th century at the junction of the two Roman roads, now Edgware Road and Oxford Street. Criminals, deviants, and social outcasts were sometimes buried at crossroads, and it's not surprising that crossroads attracted stories of witches, ghosts, and magic. Suicide victims were also sometimes buried at crossroads, generally after the body had been dragged through the streets and mocked, and sometimes even staked through the heart. Remarkably, this burial practice continued up until the Burial of Suicide Act of 1823, when it was abolished. Burying people at crossroads acknowledged that these were liminal spaces where journeys change direction and decisions must be made. The spirits of people buried there would, it was hoped, be puzzled into indecision and therefore immobility. This talk is, of course, in no way comprehensive. You can buy the book if you want that. But hopefully it has shown how ideas about and practices of mobility have always been variable and inconsistent. Mobility is not simply movement, but embodied movement, potential movement, free movement, restricted movement. And it is made up of economic, social, and political relations. Movement is an essential part of our lived experience. Throughout time, entire groups, cultures, and societies have been constructed out of the distinctive ways that they move. And it has always underpinned and informed the way we see the world. Discussions of mobility in the archaeological literature remain frustratingly rational and abstracted from the actual experience of movement, especially, I think, when discussing prehistory. Movement is so natural, so everyday, that it is easy to overlook, but we miss the real action when we do that. For this reason, we need to refocus our view of the past away from frozen places and stock-still sites to movement and mobility. By following footsteps, we find the texture of paths and the places that they connect. We hear settlements alive and full of busy people, the hubbub of business, the shouts of street vendors and the din from the inns. We see gossip spreading along lanes and alleys. These were the conduits where real life happened. Rhythms of all kinds pulsed through places and paths. By shifting our focus to the way people moved, we infused the past once again with the dynamism and the vital force it once contained, letting it live in the present. We can begin to reimagine it, to imagine monuments and the areas between them seethe and heave with life, and hear the buzz of busy streets in towns and villages. This is what could be called a mobile archaeology or an archaeology of movement, and it stands in contrast to a static view of the past that frames mobility as an economic function of being human. And so my book came out on the 6th of July and has been very well received, which delights me immensely, and please do go buy a copy. Thank you. And it's very good for stocking fillers as well. Thank you very much.